Though we may feel ourselves to be very far removed from magic, we are still very much bound up with it. Our ideas of good and bad luck, of quintessence, which are still familiar to us, are very close to the idea of magic itself. Neither technology, science, nor the directing principles of our reason are quite free from their original taint. We are not being daring, I think, if we suggest that a good part of all those non-positive mystical and poetical elements in our notions of force, causation, effect, and substance could be traced back to the old habits of mind in which magic was born and which the human mind is slow to throw off. We are confident that, for this reason, we shall find magical origins in those early forms of collective representations which have since become the basis for individual understanding. Thus, as we said in the beginning, our work has not been merely a chapter in religious sociology, but is also a contribution to the study of collective representations. General sociology may even gain some profit, and we hope this may be so, since we believe that we have shown, with regard to magic, how a collective phenomenon can assume individual forms.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is podcast. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to another magical edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we begin our discussion, we just want to mention briefly, we do have a Patreon account. Consider tossing us $1 a month over at www.patreon.com/MUHH. Today, we are going to be diving into Marcel Mauss's A General Theory of Magic, which should be a fun, speculative conversation. I've got a lot of bullshit to bring to the table. Hopefully, some of it lands with you. We'll see.
You know, one of the interesting things about Mauss, which is how you would pronounce it a la française, right? Like how you would pronounce it in French. In the biography I read. So it's assumed the family came from Germany. Their name was Mauss, and they added the S when they moved to France and adopted the French pronunciation. So as not to be associated with the little animal.
Makes sense. There's a famous graphic novel called Mouse. I think Art Spiegelman is the creator. Just total off topic, but
I was just thinking about how we had been, when we first started talking about him, we had been pronouncing his name in the Deutsch manner instead of in the French manner.
Right.
So Mauss.
It was Janosco that
yeah, Janosco, he disabused us. Or I mean, he at least, it's interesting. I think when we first did The Gift, I didn't know anything really about him at all. And I had assumed his name was, I'd assume he was German, although Marcel is a very fucking French name.
True.
His first name, right?
Yeah.
So little things from the bio before we start and delve into magic. You know, Mauss, we've talked about this, famously his uncle, only 14, 15 years older than him, even though his uncle assumed a paternal role and really facilitated his education and all this. Not too much older when we think of uncles, but his uncle's Emil Durkheim. Again, a very German last name, except for the first name, Emil. Obviously, France and Germany, they share a border and all this. But yes, Durkheim was his uncle, and he's born in 1872, so towards the end of the 19th century. And Durkheim actually came from a long line of rabbis, and he almost took up that role. Durkheim's father, or maybe when he was young, Durkheim's grandfather was like the local bigwig rabbi. in, I think it's in the Alsace area of France. They had like, I think 30 to 40,000 Jews, a sizable amount, but still in an area that was probably very hostile because, you've got the dominance of Catholicism around. But anyway, yeah, Durkheim did not take on that long tradition of rabbinical duties, and he basically was one of the pioneers to, could say, help to give sociology I would say its new foundations, its true foundations of what it, sociology was only really coined as a term, if I remember correctly, by Auguste Comte at the end of the 18th century, but it never really, if you will, became a proper discipline beyond what we know as the humanities or the social sciences, those general terms. And Durkheim helped to found what became known as like the French school of sociology. Obviously, he's not the first sociologist, but he helped to like really nail down some of the principles by which sociology would be the studying of what he called social facts, right? And so it's very much indebted to a kind of positivism. And I believe that this text, which Mauss did not write alone, by the way. Mauss was always kind of, until after World War One, where he lost a lot of his friends. Durkheim passed away in 1917. This is written in, was it 1911? Before the First World War, not too long before it. But he wrote this with, I forget his first name, but he wrote with a fellow named Hubert. That's his last name. I have to look up his first name. It's not too important, but I would say that there was a kind of coterie around Durkheim. Durkheim founded what's called the Année Sociologique, which became one of the most important, helped to found that French school around Durkheim, but it was where, they're publishing not just papers, but a lot of bibliographical, like, collating of sources from around sort of anything sociologically related, and Mauss was essential to help that going. And Durkheim was a kind of a taskmaster. He worked the people associated with it kind of really hard, and Mauss and Hubert and a few others never actually finished their dissertations because they were too busy doing all kinds of other shit. Mauss was writing a dissertation on prayer, which we actually now have translated, and it was never finished, but we have like the documents that he spent time working on. In any case, so he and Hubert wrote a previous book, which you see them mention a few times, on sacrifice. I don't even know if it was a quote unquote book. It may have first been published as a long fucking essay, just like the book on the gift. It was actually just a long essay. It doesn't really matter, but it was published in forums like the Année Sociologique. So now, I guess Mauss did write that book on the gift himself, because by that time, Hubert was either dead or had moved on to other things outside of the Durkheim circle. But it is interesting that kind of like we talk about Guattari dropping out of Deleuze and Guattari. Mauss and Hubert gets pretty much in this English translation completely. The only evidence of it is maybe the first person plural that we see throughout this text. And it's not a formal one. It is, I think once or twice, Mauss like references like one of the authors wrote on this, that, or the other. And it's like, yeah, he's talking about Hubert. I only wanted to throw that out and mention it because it does feel, I kind of feel bad for his co-author to be pretty much completely forgotten. And I think it's partly because of the success of The Gift, which was written in the 20s, I think 24. And then someone like Levi-Strauss, who, or I guess we should pronounce it Levi-Strauss, right? wrote about Mauss and how essential he was for this kind of continuity but break with Durkheim, and helping to sort of make sociology move past its sort of Durkheimian positivistic origins. But yeah, his co-author's name is not on this English translation pretty much anywhere. It may be mentioned in the forward, but I know we won't be really talking about Hubert much. I think the only other interesting things that I read in the bio was that Mauss was a committed socialist. He was very active in the kind of socialist movements at the time. He helped run some socialist newspapers. He was like trying to get these collectives started, etc. So he wasn't just, he was actually doing, if you will, trying to do practical efforts and not merely sort of theoretical stuff. But, you know, I think that his socialist friends were wanting him to sort of do sociological research that could help to become the basis and the theory that socialism would look to bolster its ideas. Does that make sense? There was a kind of continuity between theory and practice, I think, for most, and that was something I found very interesting.
I mean, a note on Durkheim, he's typically credited as the founder of the functionalist school of
Is that what they
sociology.
call it? Is that what they call it?
Functionalism, yeah. So it'd be like, I've often brought up that example of his theory of deviance, which kind of has some Hegelian parallels in terms of like this negative of deviance helps to form a positive relationship in terms of social bond, yada, yada. And I believe we talked about off air how his dissertation involved the
The
division of
division of
labor.
labor, yeah.
But he also famously has the book on I forget the full title, but it's like religious forms.
The elementary forms of religious life, something like that.
Pretty sure that's exactly what it is. So we may have to
And that would have been around this time.
Yeah.
The Elementary Forms was published in 1912, so it's right within that. Again, I'd have to look at exactly when this first came out, but it's in that period. And the biographer, again, whose name you can look it up. There's probably not a lot of biographies out in English on Mauss. I would assume that's the definitive one. Mauss is credited by the biographer, or at least from the evidence that he looked at in correspondence and whatnot. Mauss is credited with pretty much the bulk of the research and some of the ideas behind the Elementary Reforms book of religious life. In any case, it's not that big of a deal because Durkheim and Mauss collaborated themselves on other aspects and a lot. There was a lot of collective, just as in they're trying to study these collective forms. There was a lot of collective writing and research and activity and thinking together in this Durkheimian school. And so, and it's interesting you talked about Durkheim's school because the book on sacrifice that Hubert and Mauss wrote together, and that, if you remember, Girard criticizes in the piece that we recorded on about a month ago. Durkheim's the one that said, put the word function in the title, right? So it's like the nature and function of sacrifice or some shit. You know, Durkheim had his hand in a lot of pies and a lot of cookies back then, but it's interesting how much the correspondence between the two. Durkheim is not just trying to encourage him, but is like despairing that Mauss isn't doing enough work and like getting his full potential. There was a lot of shaming from Durkheim, like, Mauss, get your shit together, stop sleeping around with these women and having torrid affairs, and, you know, chill out with, you can't do everything at once, basically saying like chill out with your socialist activities and stuff. I think I mentioned to you that Durkheim seemed sympathetic to the socialist cause, just was not wanting a kind of full-scale class war, whereas Mauss was like all in that aspect. So difference in generations a little bit, a difference in, you know, Durkheim would have already kind of solidified his name and his stature and his status, whereas Mauss was kind of the rising star and still sort of in his youth when I guess he would have started becoming involved with the socialist cause in his 20s, early 20s. And he wouldn't be that old when this book is published. He would probably be in his mid 30s. So still fairly young. Anyway, that's some background. Obviously, I think that you can see a continuity, and they refer back to their book on sacrifice throughout this book, sparingly, but they do. Because if you remember towards the conclusion, they're kind of like, look, either, as we said in the preface, either magic and sacrifice are collective and have this collective aspect or not. And it seems kind of like a basic thing, like how could sacrifice not have this social collective side? But I think that they wanted to extend their earlier hypotheses about the collective sacrifice in fun to magic, which may not necessarily be so intuitively off the top of your head. When you think of magic, you might think of someone like fucking Gandalf or something, some powerful individual who's removed from society, right? And they want to try to bring us down this long road to show magic is steeped in sort of social collective belief. It's only later that it might take on individual flavor.
Which makes perfect sense. I mean, with the development of, I don't know, moving from collective investment to yada yada.
The privatization of the organs, the privatization of magic.
I can't remember what episode it was. I was positing something similar with the way that myth. Well, I should preface this by saying the idea of magic as this proto form of scientism or scientific method, or again, I can't recall which episode, but we were talking about mythology, and I was sort of positing, hey, mythology is a kind of science in itself, and then you could even see how something like the birth of tragedy, there's a sort of scientific magical element to tragedy as this collective form of libidinal investment and catharsis, right? There's a similar kind of relationship perhaps going on, although that may be more going towards religion to some extent than magic per se. But as we can see here, there's a certain overlap or parallel trajectory between magic and religion itself.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think in its origins, they want to almost situate magic in a sort of mid place. Or if you think of like a Venn diagram, there's a way in which magic overlaps with religion and technology, or what they call techniques. We can get into some of that, which I found some of those reflections fascinating. And if we return to Simondon's book on the mode of existence of technical objects, we'll see him reflecting on magic. And in other essays, he assimilates the work of the technician, quote unquote, and he's not thinking of people in lab coats, he's thinking of like ancient society. The role of the technician is kind of similar to roles that a chief or a sorcerer, magician. The word they use in this translation is magician. I think that's problematic for today's English, because we think of magician as someone who performs sleight of hand. I would say maybe a better translation is just the mage. If we're not going to say wizard or sorcerer, which sometimes they will say sorcerer, maybe that's just a better catch-all term, the sorcerer. The mage and the technician kind of share in similar aspects, because what the technician does is not a part of a general knowledge, even though he brings about these practical effects. Which is why Simondon says today that there almost don't exist technicians, because everything has become the specialization of knowledge and the work of the scientific method. Technicians veritably don't exist anymore. Everybody is just like a researcher or, just a scientist proper. But that's a whole nother thing, and we can look at that. We can maybe think back to Mauss and Hubert if hopefully we get back to some more of that Simondon and the relationship between magic, techniques, religion, which is very central to this, maybe not the development of the argument, but the conclusion of the argument in this book.
I even was going to mention Simondon when I was talking about kind of like the functionalism of Durkheim and Hegel. I was going to say maybe even Simondon to some degree would almost, in the way that the concretization, like the example of that I gave about Durkheim's theory of deviance, this negative of whatever social conflict, disagreement about norms, yada yada, gets sublated into the functional process of social solidarity so that the sort of whole can function, the machine can function more concretely. Maybe that's being too oversimplifying things, but
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what Simondon might think about someone like Durkheim.
yeah, right.
I think that's such a can of worms. I think that Simondon has something he would probably understand where you're coming from, because for him, values and norms are ways in which he tries to define sort of the difference between societies and collectives. And that's something that we would have to come to. That's towards the end of not the mode of technical objects, but at the end of the book on individuation, where a society that is not open to values is kind of dead or unevolving, and therefore kind of totalitarian, right? Because it would be like the complete entropy of norms. So you can see how maybe what you're trying to suggest is that this theory of deviancy actually enters this dialectical relation that may reinforce norms, but it keeps the norms dynamic and not static, to use
Right.
again,
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's this on, it's never resolved fully.
Right. For Simondon, the dialect is between norms and values, but we can see how the deviant could play a role in negotiating a kind of navigation between those. The values would sort of force a novelty in the system. But that's Simondon's point, though, is like a society that is not open to values is not open to novelty. Again, it's dead, it's entropy and all of this, which is why it's virtually impossible. But we can imagine a society that tries to concretize around a set of norms without being open. We can imagine totalitarian societies, right? This is why Deleuze and Guattari speak of totalitarian societies as opposed to fascist societies with their micro black holes and all of this and the suicidal out of flight. With the totalitarian societies, you've got one resonating black hole that sort of keeps desire from leaking, as they say, right? But that would also keep values from sort of penetrating those walls and allowing for novelty. That's a little far afield, but not so far. I mean,
I think the way to suture that in this is like what the coherent principle is the libidinal investment in the idea, maybe the idea of magic or the idea of the ideas that constrain action but have an unconscious force, spirit, universal spirit, things like that, right? That sort of the incest taboo, the taboos, totem and taboo, right? These sort of ideas that have a material force and reciprocal feedback loops with both, I guess, the living society and between humans and nature, because this even goes into the community, to bring Simondon again in a different fashion would be the example that they give of the metallurgist as this type of magician, in that he is following a sort of a formula, a set of practices that reach a particular end, but that, like you pointed out, is not a universal knowledge per se. It's a technical knowledge. And to draw from Arthur C. Clarke, often stated, at some level of technological development, the distinguishing point between magic and a significant or advanced technology would be difficult to separate.
Mauss and Hubert, they bring up the fact that the mage, the magician, if you want to use the translator's term, the mage is often associated with certain, we can call it occupations, but certain techniques, technologies, like the metallurgist or blacksmith or the grave digger or the barber, who, if we want to like not be anachronistic and think of a barber today, we would think of barbers who would perform surgical type of
okay, I didn't even know that was
operations. Yeah. And
Apothecaries, alchemy, yada yada, all
you're
that
right.
sort of
They're
the same shit.
alchemists, apothecary, yeah, medicine men in general, which includes shamans, and basically how they, insofar as they are associated with these abnormal substances, for example, and performing abnormal activities that are not a part of general
Right.
knowledge.
Yeah.
They, like the gravedigger has a magical aura because he has to deal with the dead, which
But it's
is also
also
why in certain societies, like in the caste system of the Brahmanic caste system, they're going to be untouchables, right? Because touching the dead already infuses you with a sort of bad jujus, or we could say powerful mana, in a way that they will describe towards the end of the book. This notion of mana, which we've seen elsewhere. For example, we've seen it in our readings of Claster, but we also saw it in The Gift and the other most book we did, that certain personages have an infusion of energy that makes it so that they, the Freud himself talked about this in Totem Taboo, right? That like the king has a certain energy that like is unstable, and so like you don't want to touch the person of the king. If you need that intermediary of the, you need someone to intercede for you, like the what do you want to call it? Just the king's functionaries,
like
his
a vizier or
advisors,
something.
or
Yeah.
yeah, the vizier, right?
I was going to say that there's also too, like, there's this strong undercurrent of, I think, Kantian philosophy behind this, and just in the generation of knowledge and so forth, because he even references, he directly uses things like a priori, yada yada. But I think empiricism too, right, plays into this with respect to the examples of the metallurgist. Maybe I'll just use that because that's easy. Metallurgist is really discovering this knowledge about nature. That's kind of a shaky maybe definition, but there's a feedback loop, there's a communication with nature, and this is where Simon Doan would kind of make sense. The transfer of information and feedback loops with the metallurgist or the blacksmith, whenever they're interacting with the metal itself, there's a type of communication and feedback that's occurring. And that is where some sort of knowledge is emerging. And this would go to science as this empirical methodology that develops out of this proto-scientific practice, where it's about the magician or the sorcerer, or what the magi, he follows a specific, almost like a scientific methodology, not mythology. There's a method that one must adhere to. And if one does not adhere to the proper method, then one does not receive the proper ends that one seeks by applying the method.
Yeah, that's the ritualistic form that has to be followed. Two things. One, I would say that I will leave aside the remarks about metallurgy for now in general, only because I think that you would enjoy Deleuze and Guattari's reflections on the metallurgist in the nomadology plateau and the sociological position of the metallurgist, which is usually cordoned off from the general populace. They're almost in a kind of in between of different societies, which gives them a certain interesting power, but also a certain way of mediating different social groups.
Right.
I'll leave that.
I mean, that's an
aside,
important point, though. I think that's an important point, though, in the text, is the way that the figure of the magical figure is always, there's either, it's like women who are considered, there's a social difference, there's an exclusion that applies to the figure of the magical. I mean, this even persists today. Like, you have the kind of trope of the magical black person, right? It's always this kind of orientalized other that is like imbued with this certain, like, I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know how else to say it other than this Orientalism sort of vibe that not only extends to women, but also to draw from, I think there's some good stuff to where Game of Thrones and like A Song of Ice and Fire kind of have some good examples we can draw from. someone like Bran, right? He falls down, he becomes injured. His injury becomes the catalyst, so to speak, for his magical abilities to be awakened. It's kind of the outcast, the different, something about them. There's a whatever category that can fill a number of different positions or what have you, right?
The social prejudice is what infuses them with a certain type of aura. I'll use that word instead of
Yeah.
mana, just to distinguish, because as Mauss and Hubert make clear, women actually don't, from the text that they're drawing on and from the different cultures they're drawing on, women actually don't have the status of magician in the way in which the prejudice would make it seem based on the histories that we know of, wherein they are persecuted as witches. There is this interesting contradiction that Mauss and Hubert pull up and point to, that this reinforces their argument that magic can also be negatively ascribed to as witchcraft and witches to those who are othered and externalized and scapegoated, to use a Girardian term. They include those with disabilities amongst that. And in fact, you see this in the Oedipus myths, where Oedipus is able to solve the riddle of the Sphinx due to the club foot that he has from the injury that he suffered as a child, being left to die. He's got the knowledge that exceeds beyond the norm, that grants him a kind of, again, a kind of technical knowledge that would not occur to quote unquote able-bodied normal individuals. So
yeah, it's almost like the imposition of the problematic creates a whole different perspective of thought. You know what I'm saying? Like the position of the outcast itself is what allows the outcast's difference from the norm is really what imbues them with a different, I don't know. I don't want to be so bold as to say like an image of thought, but I'll taint this with that kind of thing. Just in the sense of, I don't know, this it's the thing that allows them to break from tradition, or that different perspective that is not the norm, so to speak, is what kind of triggers the utility, let's say, right? Because they have to have a different utility to be able to survive in society. And I was thinking another good example from A Song of Ice and Fire is the figure of Bloodraven, who was a albino, but he's like a super powerful sorcerer, the three-eyed raven, the three-eyed crow, yada yada. It's his position as the albino outcast in society that imbues him with this ability to to act in the role of with magic, I suppose, if you follow.
Minoritarian becomings, if you want to use Deleuze and Guattari stuff again. The Kant stuff you brought back, just to circle back around to that, I mean, they are both trying to sort of utilize the philosophy that would have been like okay to use in Durkheimian sociology, but they're also trying to like complicate it a little bit. But the whole thing about the a priori is that for them, this question that Kant asks, how is the synthetic a priori as a category of the understanding possible? And Nietzsche himself asked, why is the belief in this category necessary? And I think that they are trying to do something Nietzschean with these Kantian categories by saying that magic in its origins is in fact an a priori belief. The whole system is believed or not. It's not that magic is proven to be effective in the world and therefore now I believe magic. Magic is something that is sort of sociologically, collectively inherited as a tradition and believed as a whole. So it's an a priori belief, unlike scientific method today where it's a posteriori, where we believe in science's effectivity because it produces results that can be verified, can be repeated, etc. It's a priori, but it's also synthetic. It is synthetic insofar as we believe that magic is effective. It can be applicable in various particular cases. So the universality of magic a
Right. The
priori.
categorical imperative of the method of kind of the proto aspect, right? It's the bridge between magic to science in a sense.
I wouldn't call it categorical imperative.
They emphasize how the universe, I mean, how the specific magical method or incantation or what have you, if it's not performed in a specific way, then you don't meet the outcome. Although I guess maybe I can kind of see where that gets a little
But
lazy.
I would just say, and you can totally edit this if you want. I would just say categorical imperative is more about. Remember, it's more about like, what if everyone were to do this? If you want to like boil it down, if you're going to will something, you have to see it from the perspective of making it the universal. I kind of see where you're getting, where you're saying that everyone buys in to magic in their belief. So I kind of understand what you were trying to go for there. In any case, yes. Gosh. So the Kantian language, they make an interesting point where it's a synthetic a priori, and it's only later that it becomes mixed with scientific examination and it takes on this product of reason, and it becomes more and more individualistic. And that's when it starts to, if you will, the a priori belief is itself kind of, again, in this Hegelian way, where like Hegel would show how free will, which isn't free but arbitrary, takes itself as an object and sort of runs it through these stages. The a priori belief of magic is taken as an object to be examined. And that's when it stops being this collective tradition, and it's submitted to certain analyses that would eventually, if you will, for the most part, render it less a question of belief and more this curiosity of study. They don't say as much about that, but they end the book with that before the conclusion. And one of the things that I like about this way of doing it is that for them, because we've talked about religion and we've talked about science and how magic is sort of in the middle, I like that their argument is that magic, in the collective a priori belief in its effectiveness, was the shelter for different technologies and techniques. Insofar as they were struggling along to find actual effects in the real world, magic was not disproven by its inability to affect things outside. If anything, it's kind of like conspiracy theory. Once you're inside magic, the fact that the ritual I performed didn't produce could be the fact that there is a more powerful counter magic, or could be the fact that that I did not perform the ritual correctly. So as long as you're within magic, and it'd be the same thing with like technologies and techniques, like it would provide a kind of cover for the inability to produce effects. It could still go along. This is why obviously alchemy is like the key symbol or the key like analogy for this. Alchemy stands in for this sort of tension to produce results and to verify them in different techniques like blacksmithing or metallurgy or whatever, and magic's a priori belief system.
You could even say, like, I don't know if you'll like this, but the way that the economist operates, who is like the priest of capitalism, right? Whatever contradictory evidence can be displayed doesn't matter, because you're within the collective belief is already so in capitalism or whatever system is already so strong that it doesn't matter, or it can be, what's the word, justified.
Yeah.
Despite, I forget what the word I'm looking for is.
Rationalized.
Yeah. Post hoc rationalization, basically.
Real
Which I think is what
Reaganism
you were,
has never been tried.
And that's kind of what you were getting at too, is there's kind of like, even if the magical system doesn't produce or the magical practice doesn't produce the effect, the libidinal investment in idea of magic is so great that it overwhelms reason, and then we produce a post hoc rationalization for why it didn't work. Oh, we're not doing capitalism correctly, which I think you kind of were just saying too.
It's that the ritual wasn't performed correctly, which could be the gestures. Because if you remember, for them, even the words of the ritual aren't as important as the gestures associated with it. So the ritual wasn't performed correctly, whether by word or gesture or whatnot. It wasn't the right time of day. They give that example in I think it was from the Vedas, but I could be wrong. The Brahmanic ritual that really can only take place every 45 years, right? The stars were not aligned or some shit, right? Or there is, and this is where it starts to sound like conspiracy theory stuff, where the magical effect in failing actually gives the magician, the mage, more collective belief and power, because you actually need me to try again because there's a more powerful mage, or there's a mage who already had this counter magic that I have to now counter out in my own way, right? So you're in conspiracy thinking, where the failure to, or anything that would disprove that worldview, in fact strengthens it, because there's just another layer behind.
Which goes to the cold open reading, right? Is really describing this sort of similarity. I brought up capitalism because I was also thinking about how power operates the way that power itself operates has a certain similarities or parallels with how magic operates. Because again, it's about what ideas have libidinal resonance in society, like what actually moves people or prohibits people from acting. For example, drawing from a Game of Thrones again, right? It's like Varys has the riddle that he presents to Tyrion about where does power actually lie? Does it lie in the king who orders the execution, the executioner who actually swings the sword, or something else? Power kind of resides where people believe and make it manifest through their beliefs and actions and their libidinal investments. Desiring production, producing the desire to repeat.
There is a sort of fetishism. I mean, this is what they're trying to argue, even as they go through these formulas or the objects that are imbued with mana and magical properties, etc. They go through all these different things, but in the end, for them, they want to show that what has been confused as kind of a relation between things is a relation of persons.
Which is Marx. I mean, literally.
Well, I mean, they don't say it that like I just did, but I think that they are trying.
It's heavily implied.
This is why I think they turn to something like mana, which is not just a quality, not just a substance, but is also has these verbal active aspects. And I think this is why Levi-Strauss wants to take up mana as the empty sign or the empty signifier, where it basically, wherever it is slotted in to the differential system, it can take on sort of the value within that system. But it's kind of like a free, it's like in Scrabble, you've got like the free.
Yeah, it's like the zero value or something like that, right? Even with money, kind of has some of these weird aspects, right? Because it's like the collective belief that the money has value is what drives the exchange of money.
They even point to, Melanesia is one of the island groups that they look at, and where the term mana comes from. And if you remember from The Gift, Melanesia is one of the main societies that they study to argue about, what is it, the Kuli or the Kula? One of the forms of
the Kula.
potlatch. Anyway, Melanesia gives us the word mana, and not to be confused with the biblical manna, which is interesting. I'll leave that aside because they don't even talk about it. And I kept thinking about it the whole fucking time. I think that what's interesting, they talk about certain islands in Melanesia use the word mana to mean money. There's almost a false etymology between money and mana if you if you read it in your head.
I was just about to ask if there was some type of etymology.
I don't think so. I don't think so. But there would be something interesting, because I think if you look it up in Wiktionary, monaie as a verb, I think has to do with forging and casting. So it would come down to their argument that the basic words throughout most societies for magic has to do with making, doing, producing.
Like desiring production to be
Well,
real out of nowhere. They do talk about an ex nihilo production, or maybe not production, but there is an ex nihilo. I have it in the notes.
they use the word sui generis,
That
right?
too. They both.
Okay, they use both, right? Self-generating, right? Generating out of oneself. To mint coins, to manufacture money. It may still just come from the word money, though. Right, moneta, monere, to warn, to advise. The usual derivative is by Cicero. Oh, right. It is now considered more likely the early Italian. Money has a very weird etymology that's disputed. So there you go.
Magic is the domain of pure production ex nihilo or
There
ex
you go.
nihilo.
Right. Yep.
With words and gestures, it does what techniques achieved by labor. Fortunately, the magical art has not always been characterized by gesticulations into thin air. It has dealt with material things, carried out real experiments, and even made its own discoveries.
I think my main point, because since you were bringing up the magic of capitalism, so to speak, the witchment and ensorcelment that capitalism wreaks upon us, they do point out that mana has also it has such a general expanse. It's a thing, it's a quality, it's a substance, it's an activity, it's an action. It also means money in certain of those Melanesian isles. We've talked about the abstract equivalence. There's a sense in which it makes sense to, just as most will go on to talk about in this activity of gift giving, which is also ritualistic, obviously. He talks about it that I think he might as well have said magic, but I think he uses the word spirit, that there is, there's like the gift becomes imbued with a kind of spirit that may become vengeful if there is not a counter gift, right? So we can imagine this kind of spiritual energy as a mana, as a type of mana.
I mean, that goes to sacrifice a little bit to Girard, right? Because there's almost this balancing of accounts with regard to whenever the accounts, or maybe that's not Girard,
No,
but whenever the
I think it is a balancing though, right?
whenever the
I mean, you
credits
said
and
that.
debits get out of whack and there's disequilibrium, then we have a likelihood for social conflict or war or what have you.
Yeah, the disequilibrium is the chaos of the reciprocal violence that cannot be channeled into one venting, vengeful act. The sacrifice is needed to turn the reciprocal violence into unilateral violence that is an act of the community. And that reestablishes a kind of provisional
Right.
order. That's Girard's main claim, and I think that's his main argument against Mauss and Hubert's book. They talk about the nature and function of sacrifice, but do they really get to the function of it? And I think for Girard, his starting point in Violence and the Sacred is to talk about the function of sacrifice. Right? The actual function is to unilateralize violence as the siphon that prevents it from becoming this general universal war of all against all or whatever. His critique is that Mauss and Hubert really don't theorize it. They don't get to it. They're too, and I think this shows why Durkheim was like, hey, you should add in function because it needs to be functionalist. I think that's perhaps where Mauss and Hubert, they may have tried to I don't know what's the word. They may have
Stack the deck.
Well, no, I think that they were trying to appease. They were trying to appease Durkheim, but did they really get to what, for Girard at least, sacrifice functionally does? And this is where we would have to go back and look at the sacrifice book. But he seems pretty adamant that they actually don't uncover its real function. If they claim to, they probably, for Girard, only stay at a surface level. They don't really get to its core. One of the things that I think is interesting is they take him at Fraser. he would have been like the superstar of sociology at the time outside of France, right? He would have been one of the biggest names. Their basic argument is that Fraser reduces magic to sympathy, what he calls sympathy, which for Fraser is one of two things. It is similarity and contiguity or contagion. Like produces like, and then contagion would be sort of contact, can leave this like residue that extends beyond directness. They go through this throughout the book, showing why sympathy, for them, to boil it down, sympathy is just the root of magic. It's not the source of its power.
Sympathy
But
is the logic through which magic, just to restate, because I lost you there for a second. Sympathy is the logic of magic, is right what you were saying?
yeah, sympathy is like the logic of how it works. It's not what makes it work. This is why they call it the root. It's not the source of magic's power, it's just the root. There is a kind of argument going on against Fraser throughout the book. They detail that sympathy can be found, but for them, that's not the whole of magic. That's just the kind of logic of how it works. That's not its source. But again, sympathy is a weird word for it, and I think
Yeah.
that
It definitely obfuscates things.
I think that it's not very helpful, but
I agree.
you can see that a lot of the like produces like, the similarity thing is a kind of part whole relationship, because in magic the whole is in each of the parts and vice versa, right? So there's a kind of synecdochal metonymic type thinking. This is why I think of it as a logic.
It's like a weird monism, I kind of thought as well. I mean, the kind of the Leibnizian sort of relationship. We don't have to delve into that, but this relationship between part and whole is what I found really interesting. I don't know. There's like this is where I thought Hegel was kind of creeping into my thought with regard to this dialectic between the individual magician and the social totality, or something like that, and the way that spirit is kind of emphasized as this important component of magic, or the interaction with spirit or spirits broadly, which I think may even legit, I mean, just because of the background of Hegel and there's some Gnostic stuff in the background, Jakob Boehme or whatever, the German mystic, Lutheran mystic guy. I can't really bring specific examples, but you know what I mean? I just think that some of that stuff is in the background to the discussion. Even like working on like to some extent, how could the same acting against the same produce something different? That doesn't, linear logic doesn't work that way, right? It's like, okay, it makes sense that the same and different would create a synthetic knowledge, a synthesis to get Fichtean perhaps a little and break it down a little more simple, right? It's like two opposing forces. It makes sense that they would create some unique new development that contains portions of the old practices, like and like producing a new effect. I don't know. There's something interesting.
So yeah, I think that like produces like is not a good for them. They unpack why this is insufficient, because it comes down to that like not only produces it but dominates like. This is why it can create an opposite effect. So they say something like, through poison, how is the Latin go? Nature dominates or conquers nature in the guise of poison overcoming poison. And what
Which
is
has
that?
a Hegelian sort of resonance, right? I mean,
Well,
am I
I
crazy?
mean, does it? I mean, because this would say that the like dominates like and creates an opposite effect. Is that necessarily dialectical? Does that need to go through the Hegelian matrix? Because one of the examples they give is the father and the son are castrating goats, and the father shakes the knife at the son and causes infertility or impotence in the son. And it's later that the mage takes the knife some rust off the knife, mixes it with the wine over a period of 10 days, and this cures the infertility. So, how is it that the source of the affliction becomes, it's like fighting fire with fire, right? I mean, that's the basic idea. I don't know how much, for me, Hegel is very helpful in thinking about the mode of activity that they're investigating.
Fair enough.
I would say that their analysis is actually Nietzschean. It's in the background, but their investigation and the conclusions they are led to is kind of, and this goes to your cold open, is kind of how these metaphysical notions are imbued with a certain reality and effectivity, and they are the sort of prehistory of our cogitative, facultative means of investigating reality. And those prehistorical notions, and this is where it's Freudian too, in Totem and Taboo, when Freud is thinking of the neurotic and the quote unquote primitive man and their beliefs and the effectiveness of their beliefs. You know, there is this whole residue of this a priori belief in the effectiveness of ideas. And how can we explain that as a sort of collective social reality? And how can we also, what can we derive from the, if you will, the downfall of magic? The fact that we have started to move past these magical categories in our rational thinking. And yet, a lot of these notions still, you could say, are around today. Well, what are some of the ones you read? Cause, effect, force, substance. Maybe if you follow a Deleuzian route and you look at some of Nietzsche's writings, force is the one term that he conserves, but he calls into question cause and effect. He calls into question substance. I'm sure there's some other things. Twilight of the Idols alone is all you have to look at to see Nietzsche attacking, if you will, the magical substrate that philosophy still, in its metaphysical milieu, still sort of like is immersed in. And not just philosophy, but obviously, like more generally, even like Christianity is the metaphysics of the hangman. This notion of there being a sort of substance of the ego that can take on blame and responsibility for, and therefore be judged and condemned, etc. I see them trying to do something, again, this is why it has a Nietzschean background, but it's obviously not upfront. It's kind of, there is a philosophical investigation going on here, in a good sense, right? And it's just not the dominant mode of discovery. They are trying to categorize and distinguish. They're doing that kind of Durkheimian analysis throughout, but I feel like their inspiration might be a little more varied.
That makes sense. I really liked all of what you just kind of went over. If I'm understanding correctly, then I mean Nietzsche would be opposed to the kind of Girardian understanding of sacrifice, or no?
Nietzsche would what? I'm sorry.
So Nietzsche would be opposed to kind of the Girardian functional understanding of sacrifice, then, or is that too big of a?
I don't know. I mean, I honestly wouldn't know off the top of my head. I mean, I think Nietzsche might maybe agree on the basics with Girard. I'll keep that provisional. But if you look at how Nietzsche, for example, Beyond the Birth of Tragedy, which he at the end of his life is saying it reeks of Hegelianism, and it's still too tries to be still too dialectical with the Apollonian and the Dionysian. When he reflects on things like tragedy and cruelty and sacrifice, he's talking not about the Aristotelian reading of tragedy, which he opposes, which is about catharsis. He is thinking about the heightening of affect and joy. How much festive, if you remember Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, when they talk about culture as the movement of cruelty onto bodies, they're thinking in the Nietzschean way that there's so much festive and cruel. There's so much festiveness in cruelty. So it's this like heightening of powers. And yes, sometimes it may be like materialized in the hierarchical position of the sorcerer or the king or the chieftain or whatever, but it is a collective endeavor he's talking about. He's not necessarily talking about Sod, the Sadian torturer in the bedroom with the immortal plastic bodies. That's like sort of taking this notion to its extreme in Sod, which is its own domain that's interesting. Which is why I said I would like to read Khan of Exod with you, the
Yeah,
Lacanian article. But I think for Nietzsche, there's a sense in tragedy of a sort of heightening of power and affect,
interesting.
um, and so I don't know if he would agree that sacrifice is merely this sort of logical way of restituting balance in society.
I was saying
Yeah.
sacrifice as the cathartic act of the social or whatever, because it alleviates the, because that's kind of the, maybe that's the Aristotelian notion of the tragedy, right? Is a collective sublation of these, of the negativity of death and yada yada into this collective panacea. In that way, it smooths out the collective libido or the libidinal band, if you want to.
I,
If
you know,
you're follow, do you follow me?
Yeah, no, I do, and I'm just wondering if Nietzsche would place the emphasis on the cathartic balancing act of sacrifice, or on the contrary, the fact that that is a epiphenomenon and a confusion of cause and effect, where sacrifice for Nietzsche would be seen as actually the heightening of power
Right.
in the
Because
collective. The very fact that the collective can perform such acts, I question whether he would emphasize the balance a la Girard, or the fact that unilaterality in the victim is itself this movement of power and heightening of power. So I think that that's where, when you ask me if Nietzsche would agree with Girard, I don't know. I mean,
well,
I'm kind of like taking certain parts of Nietzsche to an extreme to
sure.
try to just maybe say that I don't know if for Nietzsche, it's hard to say. I could see him agreeing, but then pushing it further and ending with a question that we have to pose to ourselves: are things that neat in sacrifice, specifically human sacrifice, or just victim and scapegoating? Is it so clean that it's about catharsis and about a sort of removal of forces and affect? I think that that's difficult. It starts to get us into a mode in which Freud hypothesized the psychical apparatus, where it's trying to keep intensity low, optimally minimal. That nirvana principle, or that principle of constancy, where it's
Yeah.
always about evacuating this buildup of pressure. I wonder if for Nietzsche, there's a kind of weird egalitarianism or even herd instinct that you could see in the background, where it is about, if the collective's main goal is to keep everything balanced, how is it that monumental figures and inequality is actually like the dominant aspect, if we look at it, rather
Yeah.
than
If you look at Christ, the people demanded, they freed Barabbas over Christ.
yeah.
Perhaps you could argue there's mono levels involved there, but like there's a some aspect of like, I mean, I don't know. It's kind of messy. I don't know if I could get,
Well,
but
no, I mean,
the whole point of
Barabbas.
my original question was the fact that because Nietzsche wants to question this belief in causality as such, because I think Girard would be a lot more invested in a more linear causality with regard to the sacrificial process, which you just articulated. That was the genesis rather of my question in terms of Nietzsche's
I mean,
position.
yeah, and the thing about Barabbas can only murder individuals, whereas Jesus is murdering a whole social fabric. Jesus is, when he
Right.
says he came to bring a sword, he's not talking about killing one individual like a murderer would. He's talking about overturning a whole social order and destroying a whole tradition and overthrowing at least 1,000+ years of ways in which a society has congealed and ossified, if you will. So he's kind of murdering a whole people, if we think of a people as constituted by their collective investments and not necessarily in their individual bodies. But
To revert a little bit back, I want to read this because this goes back to the discussion of like and effects and so forth and sympathy. This action is a sympathetic one or may be produced between sympathetic substances. It can be expressed in the following way. Like acts on like, and we should add along with our alchemist that like attracts like, or that like dominates like. They say that this is because you cannot act on the whole with the whole. Now, to me, and this may be a leap, or I may be, yeah, maybe a leap. I see this kind of idea of the whole not acting, the whole being unable to act on the whole as very Deleuzian. To me, that rings. This is where Deleuze makes sense, which I think you were sort of gesturing towards with this kind of Nietzschean element that Mauss is kind of subterraneanly communicating, or it's in the background, but I'll let you chew on that.
I mean, I think that for Deleuze, he would just say if magical thinking is dominated by this principle of similarity, like acts on like, it's not necessarily different from the way in which difference has been thought throughout the history of philosophy. Difference has always been subsumed into the concept and subsumed under identity and subsumed under likeness. So for Deleuze, it's precisely the activity of difference, qua difference, that this is why he goes to the eternal return of the same, because for him, the same is said of the different, only the extremes return, blah, blah, blah. That still like keeps us in the Nietzschean milieu, but I think for him, the equation's reverse, right? Like acts on like to produce something different. And I think
Okay.
Deleuze
All right.
would question whether that equation is appropriate. And I think that this is why he conceives repetition for itself as difference in itself when he's playfully using these Hegelian terms. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it's precisely the kind of domination of the like by the like that he sees in the traditional understanding of the concept, which is why I think he ends his life with what is philosophy when he's trying to reconceptualize not just what philosophy does, but what actually the concept does. Because for him, the concept can no longer be the concept that fails to adequately, properly take account of difference in itself. That's just sort of initial reflections. The stuff where you'd go to for magic and Deleuze and Guattari would again be 1,000 Plateaus. You would have to go to
Yeah.
the 10th plateau on becoming imperceptible. They even have some of these subtitles called like Memories of a Sorcerer, where they go into contagion and pact and these types of becomings.
Is there a etymological connection between hexaity and like a hex?
No.
No. Okay.
Mm-mm.
Too linear.
We
Goddamn.
could look up
That'd
where
be interesting.
hex. We could look up where hex comes from. Hike, HAEC, is this, or you could say this one. A hexaity is like a this one here. It's beyond the particular because the particular could still be subsumed under a concept, under an idea. Hexaity is this individuality, this singularity, if you will, if you want to use Deleuzian terms. It goes beyond or beneath the universal, particular, the general. I mean, Deleuze takes the term from, you could say directly from Simondon, but Simondon gets it more from the scholastics, I think from people like Duns Scotus, but I don't know exactly I'd have to go back and look. But yeah, a hex, Hex. Let's look and see if Wiktionary can tell us if my phone will work. Is actually related to the Old English word for witch, for hag. So the hex would be that which the hag or the witch performs.
You might want to admonish me for this, but the connection between the magician and even the witch and the sorcerer, yada yada, with the animal, the concept of the familiar or the familiar. There's a kind of weird becoming animal type. This is kind of maybe the hexaity like connection that I was kind of fucking with, which I think is, I don't know, sort of interesting because there's totemism is maybe involved here too.
They argue that the magician either inherits totemism in its downfall when totemism starts to lose its societal collective investments. The magician carries on that tradition. They also suggest, again, this is where cause and effect are not clear, that the magician may have been the first to institute it. This is implied in the text. They seem more comfortable saying that the magician's totemic aspect, which may be in a familiar, because a familiar would be a particular animal of the species, whereas for them, it's not always that the witch or the sorcerer or the mage is embodied in one particular animal. Sometimes, because of this totemic aspect, they can be sort of any of that species, depending on like which culture and tradition we look at. So they seem to imply that as totemic investments collectively lose their widespread belief or ritualistic performance, the mage inherits this individually.
Interesting. So right here is where, like, okay, Game of Thrones, the notion of the ravens, the practice of using ravens as a communication tool. So one aspect has been forgotten. It's been lost because the children of the forest literally spoke through the animals, through the ravens. But that has been lost to history, but the practice still maintains itself through the sending of the messages like a carrier pigeon style, not literally the people inhabiting the ravens and speaking through the ravens directly. So you can kind of see the totemic process or the similar process of how the totemic aspect has now declined in Westeros, but this functional process still maintains like a semblance of the initial idea. And someone like Bloodraven as the three-eyed raven can inhabit any raven or yada yada, right? It's not a specific familiar of the raven, but he often does take the form of the raven or the three-eyed crow, yada yada. But just to give a concrete sort of example of the way that the totemic society changes and the magician or whatever still carries on this practice.
The warg.
That too, yeah. That's another interesting thing, right? Because that goes to, I think warg is like has a German root and you get into werewolf.
I think it would probably be related to warlock. That would be my
guess. Yeah, there's probably a similar etymological root.
Unless it's just a word that
warg sounds like an old English word.
It's reintroduced by Tolkien. It's Old Norse for wolf. So there you go.
Never mind. I was going to say I feel like there was still some sort of issue with the, Jon Snow's wolf is albino and he's mute, and there being some type like that difference, whatever, like the physical ailment or infirmity or yada yada, or the social outcast has this ability, but wargs are feared and like were killed, and so like there is a social fear of this phenomenon in Westeros.
And apparently warlock comes from oathbreaker.
Interesting.
So not related to warg and wolf. Maybe it's precisely because the main characters in, I mean, you gave the raven, but a lot of the main characters that we see are going through wolves. The connection is the wolf. Even Brand himself, yes, there's a three-eyed raven, but a lot of the times he's going through his wolf.
which Martin specifically calls a sigil, which is spelled the same way that sigil would be in terms of sigil magic or chaos magic,
Yeah,
which relies on a sort of these diagrammatic
yeah,
yada yada. But the way that also you can see the evolution from totemic society there too, in the way that the families still have these, their heraldry, so to speak, is heavily influenced by these totemic items. A lot of animals, but not all families have animals, but there is in the text some relationship in the narrative to that totem, but that gets us afield a bit. But just to another kind of weird connection to Game of Thrones, which I thought was kind of interesting, is how they were, and this is Mauss talking about how a lock of hair, some part object of the individual could act as a stand-in for the individual. I mean, you could even see this in like the concept of what, like a voodoo doll, right? You have some representation. There's got to be some type of, like I said, a lock of hair, yada yada, some belonging, right, to that person that can act as a stand-in for that person. For example, in a Game of Thrones, there's more so a Song of Ice and Fire. They don't really get into this in the show would be the glamour, which would distort, like, so you could take someone's hair, or for example, Davos got his finger bones cut off, so he kept his finger bones in a pouch about his neck, and he called that his luck. Later in the books, there's a scene where Melisandre gives Mance Rayder this glamour so that he appears as Rattleshirt to everyone, the Lord of Bones. And it's heavily implied that she somehow has Davos's finger bones, and somehow that the finger bones are what allow this glamour process to be possible. But it could be also that there's like rubies are involved, so I might be fucking
well,
that
I
up.
mean, even the synecdoche, the part standing in for the whole, is found in all the need for blood.
Right, the king's blood. That's a good point too.
So even in the show, if you want to look at what's his name, Gendry,
Yeah, Gendry.
just the leeches and a little bit of sex magic kind of thrown in there, even if it's like maybe not consummated, just for good measure. You get a little bit of the sex magic just to get the blood boiling or hot or whatever. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Just to get it in the intense.
The libidinal charge, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. At the basis, it's the part whole. Now, it's interesting, right? Because this is the question that this, I think, exemplifies. I'm glad you made me think of this. If the blood is the root, that's the sympathy, because it's the part whole, it's the like.
Okay.
The blood standing for the person. The blue balls, if you will, the promise of the sexual act with Melisandre, the sex magic, the intensification of the blood, the libidinal band, as you said, heating up, that empowers the blood.
Just like you would have to charge a sigil for sigil magic with some type of libidinal intensity. Like a lot of times there is like semen, or there has to be some type of charging up, like you're saying, bringing up the intensity. This is also kind of cool with regard to that concept of the Gola in Dune, because you have like, we take a little bit of Duncan Idaho's flesh, and then we reproduce this ghostly apparition. We reproduce like the same.
The golem, that's what the word comes from.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. For sure. Yeah.
The golem.
It's definitely drawing on that.
It's interesting that they don't talk about golems in the general theory of magic.
That is true, right?
I suppose they could. I mean, because I think it would fit into the, if you will, you could fit it in both to what we're talking about here with the sympathetic, like producing like stuff, but you could also put it in under their analysis of demons and the invocation and evocation of spirits. There is a ritualistic way of creating a golem that is very much, if you will, theorized under technical types of creation. So you also have that interesting blending of magic and technology, which obviously has the substrate of religion, even if it be in the mystical, Kabbalistic type sense. Henri Atlan has written about golems in that first volume, Spermatic Knowledge. I think you would like reading Atlan at some point. But in any case, this sort of creation is very much fits under the demonological type aspect.
Would even go to like Frankenstein and the creation of the monster, right? These part whole and the motley of capitalism, yada yada, too. Because Frankenstein sort of is the maybe the he's kind of like the bridge in a sense, right? Because we have this quasi science and this quasi mystical process.
His name is actually the monster. Frankenstein is
Well, yeah, I
Who's the
mean,
real monster?
I was talking
Who's
about
the real-
Frankenstein as the scientist.
yeah.
Not the creation.
I love that discourse. It's like, oh, but the real monster is the
Oh,
is
I
the
gotcha.
yes, and there's also interesting traditional metaphors of men sort of appropriating the maternal powers, which is a kind of magic for us men, if you will, of creation, of giving birth, which goes all the way back to Plato or Socrates, if you want to be pedantic, right? Because Socrates learns the art of love from Diotima, but the paradoxically the philosophy is handed down man to man in this very blatantly homoerotic way. You inseminate the young male with philosophy, give birth to the beautiful, blah blah blah. Which is again why when women show up in the general theory of magic in the book we read for today, it's kind of interesting when they do show up. They show up at least twice concretely in the study, where for them it's the very fact that from the traditional sources, women are not the ones normally discussed as magicians, and yet we have these witch trials that we know of. Now, there were men too that were persecuted in these, we could say, mass hysterias under these persecutive laws, but they argued that obviously it's a product of social prejudice and that certain powerful movements like the Inquisition encouraged and sort of appropriated and used and manipulated these beliefs. So you can see how they even acknowledged that they were going to write another essay, and they never did. They were going to write another book about magic. But you can see how a separate treatment of magic, especially when we talk about, as they end the book with, about as magic deteriorates and becomes this more individual thing that's kind of applied to this rational method, they could have left space, I think, more for as magic deteriorates and it's no longer the social cohesive fabric that it once was, but now becomes more and more excised and externalized from the center and made, as we started our conversation with, to sort of embody the scapegoat or embody the other, the alien, the stranger, the threat to social cohesion. This is when we really start to see witches in this negative sense, right? So
Yeah.
the negative cohesive aspect, the deviant, as you brought
Right,
up,
yeah.
right? In the Durkheimian sense, I think that would have been, that could have deserved, I think, some discussion, this negative aspect of the magician, because they hint at it at the beginning where, you know, magic is somehow this a priori belief in collective, and obviously not in all societies, but in many of them it's like it's beneficial and believed in and seen as collective. The shaman or the chief or the magician has a high spot in the collective, but at the other hand, they point to the fact that there are other beliefs, and this is when they, as they use the Durkheimian terms, societies are no longer quote unquote primitive but become differentiated. You see a magic evolve or devolve, and you know, it's kind of interesting, like in D&D terms, the sorcerer has a sort of inborn natural force that draws upon the attribute of charisma. They have a sort of aura, whereas the wizard has to draw on knowledge because it's their dedication to the study of wizardry and grimoires and spell books and memory. And then, of course, like the cleric or the paladin, it's based on wisdom, which is the attribute of faith because it's endowed by some god. So you can see, and I know obviously I'm just making shit up, but you can see these like interesting three ways
No, totally.
of differentiating between sort of sorcery, wizardry, and we could say theurgy, right? Because divinity is divine magic, right? You can see how like each one of those ways of differentiating can explain a little bit of these differences that we're talking about. And it's perhaps that magic devolves from this kind of theurgic beginnings where it very much is similar to religion, devolves into these two different branches of wizardry where it is submitted to intense study and, collegiate scholasticism versus the witchcraft of sorcery, where it now becomes susceptible to scapegoats, persecution, inquisition. Does
Excellent.
that make sense? I think.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, you crushed that. That was beautiful. Well done.
Thanks, brother.
Very well done. I thought this idea that magical thinking could not thrive on abstraction was curious. Let's see. Let
Yes,
me read
yeah.
this. I'll read
Yeah.
the quote. This is under the heading of concrete impersonal relations. Magical thinking cannot therefore thrive on abstraction. We have clearly seen that when the alchemists spoke of of nature in general, they were referring to a very special kind of nature. For them, it was not a pure idea covering all the laws of sympathy, but a very distinct representation of effective properties. This brings up the topic of those concrete personal representations, which are known as properties or qualities, which I also just realized goes to Stirner, but that's just a side note.
I would say without us necessarily spending too much time unpacking this particular part is how they end. Because what they begin with, one of the questions they begin with, and what they criticize other contemporary accounts of contemporary sociological accounts of magic is for them, magic is not well enough distinguished from the rituals of religion. The rituals of magic and the rituals of religion really overlap too much for their liking. And so, I guess, again, without spending too much time on it, they want to suggest towards the end of the book, and I think that if they wrote another essay, they would probably put more time and effort into this. But I think for them that religion thrives on abstractions. Religion is this abstract milieu of thinking and belief. And so I think for them, if we keep magic as, again, this a priori belief, it needs to be synthetic. It needs to have concrete, particular, unique applications. Even if the rituals become generalized just as a prayer might and formalized like a prayer might, it is undertaken in particular instances to affect a particular goal. And so this is why you can easily have overlappings of religion and magic. Specifically when we talk about theurgy, when we are praying to a god for it to rain or some shit. But I think for them, the very fact that the way religion thrives is this abstract aspect, and the way that magic thrives, it's in its concreteness. I think they could go further in unpacking what that means. And so it's left to us to kind of take all of what they've done and sort of laying out the distinctions and the different manners in which magic takes place and the rites and blah, 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 the analysis of sympathy, etc., to say, okay, where then does this make sense as a distinction that religion lies in abstractions, whereas magic still holds to the concrete?
Would you go so far to say there's an empirical aspect to magic
I think that
versus maybe a transient? No.
I think that
I'm
this
really
is
gonna
what
fuck
they.
you up with.
I think that this is what they suggest that magic becomes. This is why I said like if you distinguish the magician from the wizard, it's the wizard who specializes in a kind of radical empirical investigation. It submits the magical rituals, it submits belief, the a priori belief that they talk about, to a kind of scientific or a quasi scientific rationalist examination. And I think that for them, magic in its roots is not submitted to this kind of scientific method or this kind of study. Even when its rituals are laid down, I think that once you start to apply the Enlightenment to magic and the occult, it can only deteriorate that a priori belief, at least. And with that a priori belief and that collective investment, it becomes more and more individualized. What are we left with? We are left with, I don't know. I mean, we are left with maybe some resurgences of collectives and cults around figures like Aleister Crowley and their way of trying to formulate magic. But in its general fabric, it can only be particularized and cored into, sects that are initiatory and all of this, right? I think it's this question of the empiricism you're asking about, insofar as there is still an a priori belief, and that's the collective investment in magic, and that's what gives it its longevity. I don't know if it can be submitted to empiricism, because as we said, even if my little magical ritual doesn't produce the effects that I promised it would or that we believed it would, that's just more evidence of a deeper, more pervasive counter magic. How can empiricism thrive in that era? I think that for Mauss and Hubert, magic safeguards the other technical sciences in their earliest days, in their attempts to try to make effects real in the world. Magic subsumed them and gave them a protective cover of a priori belief and allowed them to evolve and advance and progress in ways that they might not have been invested in without magic's sort of protective, collective investment and belief. That's an interesting argument to me that I really feel like could be done a lot with. And I think that Mundon himself devotes a little bit of time and sort of analyzing this himself. So that's something that I think we should come back to.
That might be like one of the central pillars of the book to some degree. I mean, I do think, and again, I may be reaching a bit with regard to like magic's relationship to transcendental idealism and Kant and like the plane of immanence or the plane of transcendence, making oneself a body without organs as this not quite magical, but there being this kind of weird synthesis, or I don't know. There's something that I found interesting about that. And I was like, the way that ideas, I don't know, the plane of immanence, maybe, and this kind of a priori belief. I don't know. You obviously know better than I do. I don't know if any of that touched a nerve or what have you. I'll rest my case.
I think that the way I would where I would jump off with that is that for Deleuze and Guattari, the plane of eminence is pre-philosophical, insofar as philosophy, in order to begin, the beginning or commencement of philosophy begins with the creation of concepts. But the creation of concepts presupposes the plane of eminence, which is why the plane of eminence for them inaugurates, the word is instaure. It quote unquote establishes. I don't like that translation but it inaugurates philosophy. It's not philosophy's commencement, but it's inauguration. So I think that for Mauss and Hubert, magic may commence with magical effects and these rituals that bring them about. But the a priori belief in magic is the plane of eminence that inaugurates magic. Does that make sense? Like you can't,
totally.
You can't do magic without the belief in magic, right? You could say chicken egg thing, but I think that for Deleuze and Guattari, they use these two different terms of beginning, of debut, commencement and inauguration in order to describe the difference between what philosophy does and what makes what it does possible. I think it's something similar, that what magic does is something concrete insofar as they say it's a practical idea. I think at the end in conclusion, they talk about, Mauss and Hubert talk about magic as a practical idea. Well, the practice presupposes the quote unquote image of thought, which is the plane of magic, say the plane of immanence, but we're just expanding that notion. But the idea, the plane of ideality that magic, that's the inauguration. That's the belief. That's the a priori belief.
Okay. What I was kind of hinting at is like, I was cajoling as like this really like a concrete example of a transcendental empiricism, so to speak, with regard to the practical aspects of it, but yet still touching on the plane of immanence and the idea, yada, yada. But I mean, I think I'm happy to finish there. I think that was really good way to tie up the episode. So good job.
And so next week we have Michael J. Ardeline.
He's accepted the invite, so we're good on that aspect.
I forwarded you the email. If you don't have the PDF, let me know. But it's
I've got it.
Deleuze Mathematics Metaphysics.
Yeah. Which is interesting because mathematics, even computer programming, like all of this shit is like literally, to go back to the Arthur C. Clarke shit, like you're literally fucking doing a spell and making a machine produce an effect. Or mathematics is like the manipulation of these symbols, and then that becomes a way to concretize to produce some effects in the world. Mathematics is this transcendental thing, exists on the plane of immanence that allows us to do whatever science, physics, yada, yada, right?
They intimate that the origins of mathematics has something magical about it. And you can see, you brought up the sigils and diagrams, that abstracting away, you can see some of that.
They had something about number. I don't know if you caught that. It's like one little throwaway line.
They definitely say that rituals are
here it is. And just as words have only a distant relationship or none at all with the things they describe between a magical sign and the object signified, we have very close but unreal relations of number.
But there are certain numbers, depending on the tradition, endowed with a kind of magical quality.
Right. 13, 3, 666, yada, yada. Which they talked about Friday as the witch's Sabbath too, which I think probably is where Friday the 13th has some relevance. But yeah, we can, if I keep on going, I don't want to keep you. So we'll wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Hacker with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins there. See y'all next week.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious. The whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.